As I come to you today, much of the world is operating under a cloud of fear and uncertainty. Here in the United States where I live, leftist lies are being leveraged with impunity by godless liberals, fomenting physical, spiritual, and emotional violence against ordinary, hardworking, law-abiding citizens. From suffocating social control measures disguised as healthcare, to an orchestrated effort to instigate civil unrest along racial lines, basic human rights are being held hostage by diabolical forces in the United States and elsewhere, even going so far as to limit our ability to worship Almighty God. I'm referring, of course, to the global COVID-19 scam and the often riotous assault on our cities that's being spearheaded by the dishonestly named group Black Lives Matter. Now, before we take a closer look at these evil operations, I want to put our present condition in perspective with some timeless commentary from Pope St. Pius X. Now, look, I realize the audience for this particular presentation is not necessarily Catholic. I get that. But I think that every person of goodwill is going to find the Holy Father's words entirely relevant to the present situation. It's a situation wherein social movements that are built upon deception, fabrication, and falsehood are being supported by any number of sincere but poorly informed individuals. Writing in 1910, in an apostolic letter, the Holy Father tells us, quote, "The primary duty of charity does not lie in the toleration of false ideas, however sincere they may be." Now, I want to stop here for just a moment because clearly there are people of goodwill among us today who are confused on this point. They seem to think that it's an act of kindness to support opinions and movements that are based upon false ideas, and in the present case, based upon outright lies. And they believe that offering the support is a good thing simply because others believe in those lies. Well, the Holy Father is telling us that far from being an act of kindness to confirm others in their ignorance, it's an offense against authentic charity. And so he continues. He tells us the primary duty of charity does not lie in the theoretical or practical indifference towards the errors and the vices in which we see our brethren plunged, but in zeal for their intellectual and moral improvement, as well as for their material well-being, end quote. Now you can sum everything up that the Holy Father just said by saying truth matters. Truth matters. And it matters because apart from truth, the good of others and the good of society as a whole cannot be attained. We have a duty to expose and to correct the errors that are infecting society. And so with this in mind, I want to talk about the cold, hard truth concerning the two aforementioned social movements, beginning with COVID-19. And let's be perfectly clear here from the outset. All of the various regulations and the restrictions surrounding COVID-19, they amount to exactly this, a social movement. It's a social engineering project that's being driven by the pursuit of political power and profit alone. One that's being orchestrated by bureaucrats and policymakers, by large corporations, and by persons of great wealth and influence that control them all. It's a movement that's ordered not toward promoting public health and well-being. That's a lie. No, its true long-term purpose is the advancement of globalism, a new world order, and a one-world government. Lest there be any doubts whatsoever about the utter insincerity of those who are shoving COVID-19 regulations down our collective throat, consider the fact that the leaders of this movement, the ones that are screaming the loudest about the need for social distancing and masking regulations, they also happen to be the most vocal supporters of legalized genocide, also known as abortion on demand, which they also insist is a matter of health care. Who in their right mind could possibly believe that someone who supports the wanton dismemberment of a perfectly healthy unborn child right up to the very moment of delivery is genuinely concerned about public health? The idea is totally absurd. Now, for confirmation as to the true purpose of these COVID-19 social movement regulations, namely the advancement of globalism, we need to look no further than the United Nations and its globalist manifesto called Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs for short. Volumes have already been written on the nefarious nature of the UN's SDGs, but suffice it to say for our purposes, they're meant to pave the road toward a utopian city of man, a global utopian city of man by the year 2030. And along the way, specific initiatives have been put in place by the UN to help it reach the SDG finish line. About the present year, the United Nations website declares, quote, "To mark the 75th anniversary in 2020, the United Nations has launched the biggest ever global conversation on the role of global cooperation in building the future we want," end quote. Make no mistake, it's the future they want. It's not the future we want. Now, is it merely a coincidence that COVID-19 is being treated in this year, 2020, as the biggest ever healthcare and economic crisis the world has seen in many generations? And it's being leveraged as such to accelerate the cause of globalism. Is it just a coincidence? I think not. And by the time we're finished here today, I think you'll see as well, it's not a coincidence. It's a game plan. As part of its vision for the year 2020, the UN website reports, quote, "In September 2019, the UN Secretary General called on all sectors of society to mobilize for a decade of action on 3 levels." A decade of action is underway. How many times have you thought and heard others say that, boy, things have changed so dramatically since the beginning of 2020? Well, that's because it was the beginning of the decade of action. And upon review, we're going to find that the UN Secretary General's action plan for building a globalist future, it's unfolding right before our very eyes. And guess what? COVID-19 lies at the very heart of it. The first level of action that he mentions consists of a call for, quote, "global action, more resources, smarter solutions," end quote. Not only has COVID-19 and the doomsday scenarios surrounding it been leveraged to promote so-called global cooperation, public policy relative to the virus, the so-called smarter solution enacted on both the local and the national levels, it served to decimate economies throughout the world. For clear-thinking, authentically charitable people, this is a genuine human tragedy. We know that as poverty increases, so too do mortality rates, death, disease, despair, all of the social ills that come with it. But for the UN globalist, who are hell-bent on building the future that they want, this is a boon. How so? Well, first and foremost, it's very important that we recognize and always keep in mind that population control is central to the globalist agenda. And this is why contraception and sterilization and abortion always feature very prominently in their plans, most notably as it concerns those who are living in the third world. The globalists know very well that an economic crisis is one of the surest ways to cull the human herd, especially in impoverished nations, those persons who are disposable. Secondly, the global economic crisis serves to help level the playing field, in a sense, between wealthy nations and poor nations. You see, in the corrupt, sick mind of the globalists, and likewise the Marxists, and we're going to talk more about them later, it's better that all nations struggle to some extent than just some flourish. Now, don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean that they're willing to suffer personally. Far from it. In fact, the bureaucrats and the politicians that have cavalierly bankrupted countless small businesses and families with their overbearing COVID regulations, restrictions based upon fake science, they haven't lost a dime in the process. And the world's wealthiest people, the Davos crowd, these are the same people who are driving the one world agenda from the behind the scenes largely. They, on the other hand, have grown wealthier in the process. Furthermore, this deliberately created economic crisis has served to prey upon the good intentions of charitable people and nations like the United States, creating a greater need for the global and the national redistribution of resources. Now, this means primarily money, but also food and medical supplies and other goods. And make no mistake about it, the redistribution of wealth lies at the very heart of both globalism and Marxism. All of this adds up to precisely what the UN intends when it calls for global action, more resources, smarter solutions. The Secretary General also called for a decade of action on the local level. Now, remember, this statement was issued in September of 2019, and it included a call for, quote, needed transitions in policies, budgets, institutions, governments, cities, and local authorities, end quote. It's amazing, isn't it? Already just over the midway point of the year, we can say that historians are forever going to look back on 2020 as the year in which the militant leftist group that we're going to detail later, Black Lives Matter, managed to hit on every single one of these points, policies, budgets, institutions, etc., with a stunning degree of success, even going so far as to popularize the magnificently delusional phrase, defund the police. And what's more, they've managed to bully numerous municipalities into implementing it. The UN's call for the present decade also includes, quote, people action. That is, youth, civil society, and of course, the media. Now, I trust it's not necessary to spend any time discussing the degree to which the media is complicit in corrupting young minds, as it's promoting liberal ideas in both their news and their entertainment program, and so we'll just move on. The UN Secretary General also called for action on the part of, quote, the private sector, unions, and academia. And lo and behold, what do we see? Major corporations have made COVID-19 the centerpiece of their ad campaigns. Companies like Amazon, Pepsi, and even Chick-fil-A have poured millions of dollars into Black Lives Matter. Unions like the National Education Association, the Teachers Union, the largest labor union in the U.S., they are desperately clinging to the COVID-19 scam as an excuse now for keeping kids out of school, further disrupting family life, something we're going to talk about in some more detail soon. Leftists in the world of academia are canceling classes and sporting events and doing whatever they can to accelerate the cause of the racial divide. So all in all, I think it's fair to say that the decade of action is going right according to plan. And evidently, the United Nations would agree. On an annual basis, the UN issues a mid-year update on its progress called the Sustainable Development Goals Report. The 2020 report, a 68-page PDF that was made public in early July, it cites COVID-19, get this, a whopping 161 times. 161 times in 68 pages. On close inspection of this document, we find that the UN can barely contain its giddiness over COVID-19. It's clear that they view the virus not so much as a biological threat or a crisis of some kind. No, they see it as an unprecedented opportunity to lend urgency to its agenda. And this includes leveraging the impact of COVID-19 to ramp up its efforts to push forward climate change initiatives, to exert greater control over global financial markets and natural resources, to force the immunization of children, especially in the third world where they'd like to see the population decreased. And of course, the big one, the effort to cull the human herd via genocide. That's always there. For example, we read in this report, quote, among the severe effects from COVID-19, millions of unintended pregnancies can be expected as tens of millions of women are unable to access family planning supplies and services. Family planning supplies, contraception, services, sterilization, and abortion on demand. That's what that means. The UN couldn't help but gloat in Report 2020 by practically celebrating the degree to which COVID-19 and the scam associated with it is already paying dividends. For example, we read, quote, the drastic reduction in human activity brought about by COVID-19 may be a chance for oceans to recuperate. Now, even in the wording of this sentence, we find deception. The fact of the matter is, the drastic reduction in human activity since the start of 2020, it wasn't brought about by some virus called COVID-19. No, it's due to draconian governmental regulations bolstered by fake science and bogus statistics. The UN goes on to rejoice over COVID, saying, quote, COVID-19 may result in a 6% drop in greenhouse gas emissions for 2020, end quote. Wasn't that wonderful? Who cares if millions of people are no longer driving to work, earning the income that they need to feed their families because their employer went out of business. Who cares? Greenhouse gases might drop. That's the UN. Now, with all that's been said thus far, I think it's plain. At least it's plain to me, and it should be to you as well. The UN Secretary General was not so much presenting a vision for 2020 as he spoke back in September 2019. He was issuing an order based on a game plan long ago written. He concluded his remarks by alerting all concerned to the overarching purpose of this so-called decade of action. He said, quote, "It is to generate an unstoppable movement, pushing for the required transformations," end quote. You know what this means, don't you? It means that the movement, which includes the COVID-19 scam and the exercise in anarchy known as Black Lives Matter, they are considered to be required and unstoppable. Now, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, folks, but we can rest assured that if the UN and its stable of wealthy, well-connected, and powerful globalists have their way, neither one of these diabolical operations are going anywhere anytime soon. Not without a fight, and most certainly not without the grace of Almighty God. So, given that the leftists aren't about to let the panic that they've incited over COVID-19 diminish, today they're doing just what they did back in the spring. They're moving the goalposts. Initially, I'm sure you recall the scare tactics involved forecasts of more than 1 million dead in the U.S. alone. Some of the models had more than 2 million people dying. And after it became clear that this was pure fantasy, we were fed predictions suggesting that our hospital system was going to be stressed well beyond its capacity. We were told that the goal of the so-called social distancing and mandatory masking guidelines was to flatten the curve. This is an expression that's going to be repeated in bad jokes for decades to come. Well, in an effort to ensure that the curve and public panic would remain as high as possible, the CDC in the United States created a death certificate coding system that was designed to maximize the COVID death count.
I just want to be clear in terms of the definition of people dying of COVID. So the case definition is very simplistic. It means at the time of death, it was a COVID positive diagnosis. So that means that if you were in hospice and had already been given, a few weeks to live, and then you also were found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death. It means that technically, even if you died of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. So everyone who's listed as a COVID death doesn't mean that that was the cause of the death, but they had COVID at the time of death. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, doctor, this is very helpful indeed. And let's be clear, Illinois isn't going rogue here. No, they are simply following CDC guidelines, just like every other state in the United States. But it gets worse. It gets worse. Those CDC guidelines allow for COVID death totals to include, get this, patients that were never even tested for the virus. At one point, New York City, not New York State, New York City added over 3,000 of just such deaths to its COVID-19 stats in just one day. In just one day. These so-called probable deaths, as they're referred to, they are part of the CDC's official running total of COVID deaths. What a travesty. Now, bear in mind, the way to eliminate the guesswork in this case is no more complicated than swabbing the back of a deceased person's throat. That's it. As I speak to you today, over 40 million people in the United States, the vast majority of whom are perfectly healthy, have been tested for COVID. Now, why isn't this being done in every single case where a COVID death is suspected? Well, the reason's perfectly plain, folks. This entire charade is not about science. It never has been. It's not about the scientific method, a necessary component of which is the collection of reliable and measurable data. It's about social engineering. It's about the decade of action. It's about promoting a movement. That's what it's about. Over the past few months, physicians from all over the U.S. have reported that they're being pressured to code death certificates as COVID-19. And all of these deliberate acts of deception are being employed to add fuel to the doomsday predictions, one of the most enduring of which concerns this allegedly soon-to-be overwhelmed hospital system. As a result, Millions upon millions of dollars were spent setting up temporary medical facilities to handle the forecasted patient overflow. Convention centers and sports stadiums in various cities were turned into field hospitals with hundreds and hundreds of beds. In Seattle, for example, CenturyLink Field was converted into a 250-bed facility, 250 beds, with an on-site lab, with x-ray machines and operating rooms. It even had its own intensive care unit, all of it set up at taxpayer expense. Before being disassembled, this multi-million-dollar field hospital treated exactly 0 patients. 0. The United States Navy ship Comfort, a hospital ship with 1,000 beds, 12 operating rooms, and a crew of about 1,200. It was deployed to New York City, where it stayed for nearly a month, during which time it treated a grand total of just 179 patients. Patients that could just as easily been treated in regular hospital settings. The United States Navy ship Mercy, which is also a hospital ship of similar size. It was deployed to Los Angeles, California, where it treated, get this, a whopping total of 77 patients over the course of 7 weeks before pulling up anchor and departing. Not only did the forecasted overflow of patients never materialize, many hospitals across the U.S. found themselves operating so far below ideal patient capacity that they had to lay off their staff, including nurses and doctors. Some of the hospitals had to file for bankruptcy, and a number of them will not recover, leaving the communities that they once served without a hospital system. In spite of all the subterfuge and reporting, the data now clearly shows, I guess they couldn't hide this fact, that over half of those who are reported to have died from COVID-19 were elderly persons living in nursing homes and other long-term care facilities. And the vast majority of overall deaths occurred among persons in excess of 70 years of age, regardless of where they lived. The rest were almost exclusively among those who had other serious pre-existing health issues. World-renowned epidemiologist Dr. John Ioannidis of Stanford University, a guy whose credentials are absolutely impeccable and beyond question. He recently reviewed the data available from all over the world, and he concluded, quote, "For people younger than 45, the infection fatality rate is almost 0%. For those 45 to 70, it is probably about 0.05% to 0.3%. For those above 70, it escalates substantially. So we have a very well-defined small portion of the population that is threatened with death from COVID-19. So let's fast forward to today. Deaths from COVID-19 have absolutely plummeted. They've plummeted so sharply since their peak in April, there is no curve. Forget flattening. The curve is gone. This graphic tells the story. And this is in spite of the fact that the numbers are still being substantially padded. The books are still being cooked to paint the worst possible picture. Now, this being so, what are they doing? Well, the goalposts are once more being moved as the daily cry of leftist politicians and bureaucrats and media members now concerns a spike in cases and an increase in COVID hospitalizations, both of which, as you're going to see, are dubious claims, to say the least. So, what exactly is a COVID case? Well, back in early May, roughly 300,000 COVID-19 tests were being administered every day on average in the U.S. That's a lot of tests. But since then, the number of tests has nearly doubled. It's well over 500,000 per day. And anyone whose test comes back as positive is counted as a case. Now, clearly, folks, this part of it's not rocket science. As the number of tests increase, so too do the number of cases. But that's not even the half of it. In recent weeks, breathless news reports here in the U.S. about a spike in cases often focuses on states like Florida, where left-wing politicians are now taking the opportunity to tighten the screws on the population once again. But get this. The Orlando Sentinel, which is a mainstream media source, it's just a typical liberal newspaper, they're reporting that a number of the labs in Florida have been misreporting their results. In one case, a lab was reporting a 98% positivity rate. Upon closer inspection by investigators, they discovered that the actual rate was 9.8%. So what's in a decimal point, right? Let us not be naive, folks. There's little doubt that Florida is not alone in this magnificent screw up, this deliberate misreporting and misrepresentation of the facts and figures. Now, you add to this the unscientific, the misleading, and the inaccurate criteria that's been used to determine COVID deaths that we just discussed. And how can we trust in any of the data that's being publicized? How can we possibly trust these people? Well, the answer is we cannot trust them. Deception lies at the very heart of this operation, and it has from day one. That's the truth. Regardless of the actual number of true positive test results, the overwhelming majority of these persons have no symptoms. They're perfectly healthy. And what's more, there's no evidence at all that they're passing the virus on to anyone else. In fact, on the contrary, don't take it from me. This information is coming directly from the CDC and the World Health Organization, both of which are not on our side, believe me. On Thursday, June 25th, 2020, the CDC conducted a telebriefing with journalists, and there's a transcript and audio recording of it available on the CDC website. During this briefing, according to the CDC director, Dr. Robert Redfield, quote, "This virus, COVID-19, causes so much asymptomatic infection. We don't know the exact number. What the ultimate number is going to be. Is it 5 to 1? Is it 10 to 1? Is it 12 to 1? But I think a good rough estimate right now is 10 to 1, end quote. Did you get that? For every panic-inducing news report about a spike in cases, over 90% of them are asymptomatic. And guess what? Those persons are not transmitting COVID-19 related illness to anyone else. On June the 8th, 2020, Dr. Maria Van Kerkhove, who is the head of the World Health Organization's Emerging Diseases Unit, again speaking to reporters, she stated, quote, "From the data we have, it still seems to be rare that an asymptomatic person actually transmits onward to a secondary individual. It's very rare," end quote. Now, the data to which she is referring here was collected in nations that conducted studies using aggressive contact tracing measures, something we're going to talk about later. In reality, folks, there is no reliable data whatsoever indicating that any asymptomatic person ever transmitted COVID-19 to anyone else. No data whatsoever. Now, after sharing this dirty little secret, Dr. Van Kerkhove and WHO came under immense political pressure to walk it back. Political pressure, not pressure from actual scientists and physicians. And why were they brought under so much pressure? Well, because lying, power-hungry leftists are determined to use reports about a spike in cases and an increase in COVID hospitalizations to instill fear in the ill-informed. Why? Simply so they'll be more likely to comply with social control initiatives that have nothing to do with public health. Now, at this, it's necessary for us to say a few words about the recent increase, or I should say alleged increase, in COVID hospitalizations. Now, recall what the Illinois Public Health Director told us. She said that if an individual is in hospice and has already been given just a few weeks to live, but then subsequently has come to find a COVID virus positive test, well, that would be counted as a COVID death. She plainly said that even if there was a clear alternate cause, it's still going to be listed as a COVID death. Well, now, the same deceptive criteria is being employed by leftist politicians and their friends in the media to create hysteria over an alleged increase in COVID hospitalizations. Also pushing this lie forward are hospital bureaucrats who are getting compensated for fudging the numbers. You may recall, beginning in March of this year, not only were elective medical procedures canceled in numerous states, many people avoided going to the hospital, even when they really should have gone to the hospital to be cared for. They just wouldn't go there. They were scared to death. Well, now elective surgeries are resuming, and it's become obvious to many of us that the risks associated with COVID-19 are exceedingly low for the vast majority of the population. And so hospital occupancy rates are on the rise. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing. Hospital associations across the country have long published what they call the sweet spot for hospital occupancy, that occupancy rate that allows the hospital to stay financially solvent and able to well serve the communities in which they're located. That number is between 88 and 95%. We're well below that nationally. Anything above that sweet spot, you could arguably say, is approaching a stress limit for the hospital. But we're not there, folks. On July the 2nd, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, a state that we've already noted as frequently being named in the media panic reports, he said, quote, "I spoke to various Florida hospitals today. As many as 40% of their COVID-19 hospitalizations are not in the hospital for the virus and aren't even being treated for it. That means that people who are going into the hospital for a knee replacement or for back surgery, or even women going into the hospital to deliver a baby, if they have a positive COVID test and are completely asymptomatic and totally healthy on that particular note, they're being reported as a COVID hospitalization." Look, we've heard this song before. These reports of a soon-to-be overwhelmed hospital system due to COVID, just as they were back in the spring, they're being purposely exaggerated in order to keep the public in a state of panic and therefore compliant with social control initiatives disguised as healthcare. And among those initiatives comes the aforementioned contact tracing program. Now, this is a doozy. For an explanation on contact tracing and what it entails, we're going to turn to a Dr. Robert Levin. He's the health director for Ventura County, California.
A community contact tracing program. We've done contact tracing all along. That a contact is a person who's been exposed to someone that we document to have the COVID infection. When we find someone who has a COVID infection, those people are immediately isolated. But we also work with them to figure out who their contacts were. As we do more testing, we will find more and more people who have COVID-19. And again, we'll isolate every one of them, and we will find every one of their contacts, and we will make sure that they stay quarantined, and we'll check in with them every day.
Well, this invites a question. What if the living conditions for the targeted persons are not conducive in the state's opinion for quarantine in the home? Then what? Dr. Levin explains.
We also realize that as we find more contacts, some of the people we find are going to have trouble being isolated. For instance, if they live in a home where there's only one bathroom and there are 3 or 4 other people living there, and those people don't have COVID infection, we're not going to be able to keep the person in that home. Every person who we're isolating, for instance, needs to have their own bathroom. And so we'll be moving people like this into other kinds of housing that we have available.
That sounds like an internment camp, doesn't it? Dr. Levin went on to say that similar programs are being launched all over the United States. In fact, all over the world. According to a May 18th New York Times article, quote, "Estimates for the number of people needed nationwide for contact tracing range from 100,000 to as high as 300,000. End quote. Imagine that, 300,000 employees in this governmental surveillance program. That would make contact tracing and the program associated with it 5 times bigger than the Social Security Administration. It's unbelievable. And if you think all of this sounds bad, I can promise you it's only going to get worse. This contact tracing program was once hyped as a voluntary program. We were told citizens could either opt into it or they could choose not to participate. Well, that dog didn't hunt for very long. It's recently been reported by MSN that the unelected health commissioner in Rockland County, New York, she's lost her patience with those who, go figure, won't answer the telephone calls that are coming from contact tracers. And so she told reporters, get this quote, "I am now forced to send subpoenas. Failure to comply will be costly. $2,000 per day," end quote. So much for voluntary, right? And you can bet your bottom dollar that the threat of jail time is not far behind here. So to conclude this look at the COVID-19 scam, before we move on, and based on everything that we said, one cannot help but ask a number of questions. First of all, Why are we testing over 500,000 healthy, non-contagious people every day for COVID-19 in this country? Why? Why are we doing that? Why are we still being forced to practice so-called social distancing for a virus with such a minuscule infection mortality rate, one that's concentrated on a very narrow part of the population? So much cruelty has resulted from social distancing. People dying in the hospital without their family members and friends by their side. It's terrible. Funerals that most of the family members can't attend. It's just a terrible situation. Why are people in various parts of the United States and the world still being subject to mandatory masking regulations? Why are contact tracers being paid by the government to surveil law-abiding citizens? Now, if you answered public health to any one of these questions, I have bad news for you. You are either a damned fool, or worse than that, you're a godless liberal. And I feel sorry for you. Now, this brings us to the civil unrest that's taking place in cities across the globe, at the forefront of which is the deceptively named group Black Lives Matter, a situation that's fast becoming an election year tradition in the United States. In fact, the reason that both COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, or BLM for short, are getting so much play right now is because power-hungry, diabolical leftists see these as winning issues. In other words, they're merely using these things to ratchet up our collective misery in the hope that doing so will somehow reflect poorly on the current administration in the U.S. and somehow earn them more votes. That's the bottom line, folks. Just 30 seconds of watching CNN, if you can stand it, the Communist News Network. It's enough to prove the point.
A global pandemic, an overdue reckoning on race, an economic crisis, and an election right in the middle of it all.
Sure, an election right in the middle of it all? Nonsense. It's more like fake news, psychological operations, and a pre-planned civil unrest operation right in the middle of an election. Well, according to the United Nations, speaking of civil unrest, Black Lives Matter is a, quote, nonviolent international activist movement that campaigns to promote and protect human rights and dignity of Black people, end quote. But is it really nonviolent? Is it really all about human rights and dignity? You tell me. After these BLM protesters chanted those threats against the lives of police officers in 2014 and 2015, respectively, the media still insisted on defending the group as nonviolent. Well, in 2016, BLM made good on their threats. During a BLM protest in Dallas, 5 police officers were ambushed and killed. In spite of this terrible tragedy, the media repeatedly reported that the event was peaceful. At a memorial service in honor of the fallen officers, the president at the time, Barack Hussein Obama, used the occasion to run cover for BLM, saying before the grieving family members of these fallen police officers, quote, "We cannot simply turn away and dismiss those in peaceful protest as troublemakers," he said. Over the last month or so, as riotous mobs, if not directly organized by, at the very least encouraged by BLM, they have viciously attacked persons, both young and old, for the high crime of being white. They've looted and they've burned down businesses, many of which are owned by hardworking Black people. And they've destroyed statues and other public property with reckless abandon, with no fear of repercussion. And what exactly have local leaders in these overwhelmingly Democrat-run cities been doing as these things have been taking place? Well, not only have they been sitting back and letting it happen, they've been subtly and not so subtly encouraging it. No, the Black Lives Matter movement is neither peaceful nor is it nonviolent. And guess what else it's not? It's not about Black lives. In 2015, Patrisse Cullors, she's one of the 3 founders of Black Lives Matter, she was asked if the organization has a, quote, ideological structure that would serve to sustain the movement going forward. And she answered, quote, We actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia, another founder, in particular, are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. Karl Marx, the author of the infamous Communist Manifesto, is, of course, the father of Marxism. It's a philosophy based upon class struggle. Originally, this meant pitting the proletariat, the working class, against the bourgeoisie, the wealthy class of business and landowners. Today, black versus white, socialist versus capitalist, gay versus straight, etc. These are equally as effective divide and conquer strategies for the Marxist. And the entire point is to foment division and unrest and ultimately revolution, as these are the necessary steps toward destroying, in this case, the American way of life. And the overall goal is to achieve the utopian idea of a classless communist society, not just here in the US, of course, but globally. In other words, violence and the threat of violence is endemic to Marxism, which, according to the founder of BLM, provides the organization with its ideological frame. And so this brings me back to Pope St. Pius X, who in the same apostolic letter calls our attention to the wisdom of his predecessor, Pope Leo XIII, who addressed this foolish notion of a classless society. Leo XIII wrote, quote, "Christian democracy must preserve the diversity of classes, which is assuredly the attribute of a soundly constituted state, and it must seek to give human society the form and character which God, its author, has imparted to it." End quote. Did you understand what the Holy Father was saying there? He's telling us that the diversity of classes in society, it's not a problem to be solved. It's not a societal illness that has to be healed. Rather, it's been imparted to human society by Almighty God himself. And so this means that those who are laboring to obliterate the classes, the Marxists, the globalists, the socialists, the communists, in addition to engaging in a fruitless endeavor that simply can't succeed, they're at war against both God and man. And this becomes all the more obvious the deeper one looks into the true character of Black Lives Matter. It's an organization that claims to be motivated to act in our day in response to systemic racism against black people, as they say, which the organization insists is part and parcel of law enforcement in the United States. But is this truly the case? Is it true, as BLM claims on its website, that, quote, "police killings are now a leading cause of death among black men"? Is it true, as they also insist, that, quote, "police continue to mistreat, terrorize, and even murder boys and girls of color and then walk free," end quote? Well, evidently, the globalists at the United Nations believe that these things are true, or at least they want you to believe that they're true. According to their website, quote, "the brutal killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police in the U.S. drew the attention of the world once again to systemic racism and white supremacy. Unfortunately, police brutality and other human rights violations against black people are a daily routine in various parts of the globe." Now, I can't speak for the entire globe, but only in the United States. And unfortunately, those lies have been repeated so often that many people simply accept it as a fact that police brutality against blacks is a daily occurrence in the U.S. Or, as the ACLU put it in a recent fundraising campaign, get this, quote, "black people are being murdered and brutalized by police with near impunity," end quote. But make no mistake about it, folks, no matter how many times they repeat it, it's still a lie. In a June 2nd article in Wall Street Journal, Heather McDonald, a criminal justice expert researcher and the author of the book The War on Cops, published in 2016, she shared some data, some cold, hard facts that the mainstream media does not want you to even consider. In 2019, police officers fatally and shot a total of 1,004 people in the U.S. About 25% of them were black. In other words, less than 300 black persons were killed by the police last year. So much for BLM's ridiculous claim that this is a leading cause of death among black men. And we're going to talk about what actually is the leading cause of death in that community. Now, that ratio that says that 3 times as many white persons as compared to black persons are shot and killed every year by police has held true every year since 2015. And this invites an obvious question. Why do blacks account for 25% of fatal police shootings when they only comprise 13% of the population? Now, that's a really important question. And a leftist, a godless liberal will shoot from the hip immediately and say systemic racism is the reason. But that's not the answer. The true answer is provided by Ms. McDonald. In 2018, the latest year for which data is available, African Americans made up 53% of known homicide offenders in the U.S., and they committed 60% of the robberies. Now, is it racist to merely point this out? Well, according to those on the left, I'm certain they would say that it is. But data is not racist. It's neither liberal nor conservative. It's simply data. And in this case, it gives the lie to the leftist narrative. Now, it's really important to understand here. The police don't have a confrontation or an engagement with every single citizen of every race every year. Now, I know this much is entirely obvious, but evidently it must be said. The police only engage those who are either committing or have committed or are suspected of committing a crime. In the case of black suspects, guess who's calling the police? Well, far more often than not, it's a black victim. It's a black victim. One has to ask, do their lives matter to the godless liberals who keep repeating the lie about systemic racism in policing? I'd say evidently not. Now, bearing in mind the actual crime statistics, the data that we just went over, and data, frankly, that no credible person is disputing. The fact that over half of the homicides and nearly 60% of the robberies are being committed by black persons in the U.S. If you take a good hard look at those statistics and you don't just dismiss them out of hand, the true picture becomes very clear. And it's exactly the opposite of what lying liberals want everyone to believe. The fact of the matter is, folks, white persons are more often shot and killed by the police per engagement, per confrontation, than blacks are, and by a considerable margin. Also, bear in mind that the vast majority of homicides and robberies are committed not by females, but by males. And this is true of all races. Now, as such, it's far more accurate to say that approximately 6% of the population, black males, are committing roughly half of all the homicides and robberies in the United States. Again, is it racist to acknowledge these statistics? Of course not. And this is why black men, yes, we have to admit it, including law-abiding black men who have done nothing wrong, are more often stopped and questioned by the police than white men. That's the truth. Now, is this a problem to be solved? I'll be the first to say it. Absolutely. This is a problem to be solved. But the way to solve it is to recognize it for what it really is. It's a symptom. It's a symptom. And to get to the disease, we need to ask another critically important question. Why are so many of the violent crimes in the United States committed by so few of the people? Now, this is a question that godless liberals are loath to answer. And the reason is simple. It's because they know damned well that practically every American city with a predominantly black population has been run and run into the ground at that by Democrat politicians for generations on end. More specifically, they don't want to call attention to the reality that it's liberal politics. It's not systemic racism that's responsible for creating the economic and the educational inequities that lead directly to a life of crime. Look, I live just outside of Baltimore City in Maryland. It's the murder capital of the United States, or at least it's in the top 2 or 3. Now, the last time I checked, the average cost per student in the Baltimore City school system is about $17,000 per year. That's the average per year, K through 12. And I can promise you, there isn't a parent on planet Earth worth a wooden nickel, be that person a liberal or conservative or anywhere in between, that would write a tuition check for even a fraction of that amount to send their kids to any one of Baltimore City's schools. If they had a choice, they wouldn't do it. The public school system in this country, which is treated as the private piggy bank of the teachers' unions that serve as arms of the Democrat Party, they've been failing the black community for decades on end. Now, you couple this with the fact that over 70% of black babies are born to unwed mothers in this country. over 70%. And this is another liberal achievement, make no mistake. And between these two things, you have a perfect recipe for creating criminals, both black and white. Even so, guess how many times the epidemic of single-parent homes and unwed mothers in the black community is addressed on the BLM website? And I'm talking about the entire website, which has numerous pages on it. If you answered 0, you are correct. By contrast, what do we find on the pages of the BLM website? Well, we find things like the following, quote, "We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another. Every day we recommit to healing ourselves and each other and to co-creating alongside comrades, allies, and family a culture where each person feels seen, heard, and supported. We engage comrades with the intent to learn about and connect with their contexts." Did you catch those buzzwords, folks? Comrades, villages, collective care. This is chicken soup for the Marxist soul. But more noteworthy, however, did you notice how, far from decrying the sad reality that the majority of black children are deprived of a two-parent home, BLM actually seeks to destroy such family structures even further. In fact, on their What We Believe webpage, while family and mother are mentioned any number of times, fathers and fatherhood aren't mentioned even once. Not even once. So for all of its bluster over black males that are allegedly being killed by police officers for next to no reason at all, BLM evidently has precious little concern for black men at all. In fact, one of the three founders of BLM, 3 black ladies, 2 of them are outspoken militant lesbians. Now, knowing this, it may not come as a surprise to you that we also find on their webpage of stated beliefs the following, quote, "We foster a queer affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intent of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather, the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless she or they disclose otherwise. We are guided by the fact that all Black lives matter regardless of actual or perceived sexual identity, gender expression, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs or disbeliefs, immigration status, or location. We make space for transgender brothers and sisters to participate and lead. We are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege and uplift Black trans folk, especially Black trans women who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic violence," end quote. Boy, that's a mouthful of homo activism, isn't it? And of course, no friend of the United Nations can fail to promote the sacrament of the left, and that is, of course, abortion on demand. And Black Lives Matter is no difference. They declare, quote, "We deserve and thus we demand reproductive justice that gives us autonomy over our bodies and our identities." Reproductive justice. This is just more godless liberal speak for abortion on demand, and everybody knows it. So tell me again just how much concern BLM actually has for Black lives. In New York City, where the as yet unmentioned 3rd co-founder of BLM lives, Opal Tometi, more Black babies are murdered via abortion every year in New York City than are born alive. Can you imagine that? It's not police killings, that is the leading cause of death among all Black persons. Now, do these Black lives matter to BLM? Do they matter to their financiers and their supporters? I'd have to say, obviously not. Now, more could be said about both COVID-19 and BLM, but I think the dots have been sufficiently connected here to show just how deeply these diabolical social movements are related to the United Nations, to its globalist agenda, and to the decade of action in which we find ourselves today. Now, there might be a better way of expressing it. It seems to me that we've arrived at a place in human history that we might describe as a post-political age. And what I mean by that is this. Look, politics has always been about far more than just left versus right, liberal versus conservative, Democrat versus Republican, and so on. Underneath it all, just below the surface of all the wrangling about policy positions and legislative initiatives and social programs and so on, there has always been that age-old struggle between good and evil, between those who are laboring to build the city of God and those who are hell-bent and determined to construct the city of man. In recent years, though, something has changed, and even more so over the past several months, since the beginning of 2020. Political maneuvering and social movements have become so transparently deceitful, so cruel, and so destructive that the once underlying reality is now up on the surface. It's right there for all to see. Not very long ago, speaking for myself personally, there was a time when I was able to enjoy cordial relationships and engage in leisurely activity in social and family settings with self-identified liberals, firmly committed Democrats. I used to tell myself that even though these people are sadly mistaken on some very important matters, still, they're decent people. They just happen to have a different political opinion. Well, folks, those days are over. Today, I find that proposition utterly untenable. The reality is, we have next to nothing of value in common. Nothing. Now, abortion on demand, something we've mentioned a number of times today. This issue illustrates the point perfectly, I think, because abortion is such that it needs to get the unqualified support of every person who wishes to align themselves with the political left. It's the non-negotiable price of admission to the political left. Now, at one point, even though it's always been very unconvincing, the justification that was used by the left for killing the unborn revolved around this notion that it's just a blob of tissue. Well, then came detailed 3D sonograms that tell a completely different story. But our liberal friends were totally unmoved. Discussions then took place in the medical community about fetal pain, right? Surely the compassionate left, they would take this into account, right? Because nobody on the left really wants to see anyone suffer. Am I right? No, dead wrong. Liberals remained totally unmoved. Legislation seeking to affirm the dignity of babies who are born alive, has been presented over and over and over again in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And every time, the godless liberals stood firm and would not support it. Over the past year or so, all pretense has been set aside. Numerous states have passed abortion legislation that's so blatantly opposed, even to the most basic tenets of the natural law, that there's just no way to avoid the obvious. The truth is, those who would align themselves with the proponents of genocide, which here in the United States is the Democrat Party, they are in league with Satan. Now, to be very clear, I do not mean to suggest that their political rivals are a model of godliness. They're not. The Republican Party in the United States is dripping with its own brand of evil as well. Lesser, perhaps, but evil nonetheless. On the whole, they're just as guilty of making calculations based upon what will secure the most votes, the common good be damned, as the Democrats are. That's the truth. And this is exactly what I mean when I say that we live in a post-political age. Ladies and gentlemen, there have always only been two sides from which to choose in this battle called life on Earth. But right now, as I speak, it's more obvious than ever, at least in my lifetime. One is either on the side of God Almighty, or one is on the side of his adversary. Period. There's no other choice. Now, whether or not individuals who willingly align themselves with the political left subjectively realize that they've chosen to serve the evil one over and against God, well, that's the Lord's call to make. But even so, the objective fact is perfectly plain. They are serving the cause of evil. So, what should we do about it? What should we who sincerely wish to build and defend the city of God, what do we do in the face of this terrible situation where evil appears to be winning the day? Well, first and foremost, we have to pray. We have to fast. We have to commit ourselves to living a godly life. I mean, no easy task, but that's what we're called to do in every age, all the more right now. But removing oneself from the temporal arena, that's not an option for us. It's not an option. We have a duty to fight for the common good. And on that front, there's no easy answers for how we can best do so. But I do have one suggestion that I would make, and it's a simple one. And it concerns something that we talked about earlier, these mandatory masking regulations, which are nothing more than a social control tactic that's based not upon science, but entirely upon deception, which is the stock and trade of the evil one. Now, in the face of this ruse, I firmly believe that it's time for citizens to stand up and just say, no, we will not comply with this. No, we will not strap a mask to the face of our small children. We're not going to do it. And if we act in large enough numbers, I think we can prevail. Now, yes, admittedly, this is a very small part of the overall battle, but small victories matter. Why? Because as the Holy Father said at the outset, truth matters. And we have truth on our side. We have truth on our side. So on that note, consider visiting the website operationunmasked.us. And there you can learn more about how to go about pushing back against these overbearing social control regulations. All sorts of expert commentary and articles that touch on some of the topics that we talked about today. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can also find links to offer your support. In conclusion, I'll repeat what is perhaps the most important thing that I said over the course of this hour or so. The evils that we discussed, they are not going anywhere anytime soon. Not without a fight, and absolutely certain they're not going anywhere without the grace of Almighty God. And so at this, I want to wrap things up here by turning once more to the wisdom of Pope St. Pius X, who said, quote, "If the highest possible peak of well-being for society and its members is to be attained through fraternity, or, as it's also called, universal solidarity, then all minds must be united in the knowledge of truth, all wills united in morality, and all hearts in the love of God and His Son, Jesus Christ. May it please the Lord to open the eyes of all, left, right, and everywhere in between, to the knowledge of truth, and to grant to all of us the grace to lead others to the love of God and His Son, Jesus Christ." Thank you.